Today, we got news with yet more evidence that the Trump administration is continuing to take actions to weaken and undermine Ukraine in advance of peace negotiations and to remove President Zelensky as a barrier. It's now been reported that 4 senior members of the Trump team have held secret talks with some of the leading political opponents to Vladimir Zelensky. Specifically, the Ukrainian opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko and senior members of the party of Petro Poroshenko, the previous president. This is according to 3 Ukrainian parliamentarians close to the talks, as well as a US Republican foreign policy expert. Reportedly, the discussions focused on whether Ukraine could hold quick presidential elections. You'll remember that the 3-part plan discussed by Russia and the United States at the summit in Riyadh was that a ceasefire would be agreed, then that the existence of a ceasefire would be used to press Ukraine into holding early elections on the assumption on the part of the Kremlin and the US that Zelensky would lose. And then you would have someone in position who they believe would be more pliable, and only at that point would peace negotiations begin in substance. This report is the latest confirmation that the US is an adversary of Ukraine, looking to covertly undermine its leadership, interfere in its internal affairs in order to deliver a more congenial result to Vladimir Putin following his invasion. I mean, that is the logic of these events. If anyone can come up with an alternative explanation not based on magical thinking, then by all means let me know. In recent times, both Tymoshenko and Poroshenko have publicly opposed holding elections before the end of the war because there are obvious practical reasons for one thing. Probably they also don't want to take the poison chalice of being the brand new president who hands away a big chunk of the country to Vladimir Putin. But that's just a starting position, because obviously the United States might consider itself to be relatively skilled in the art of persuasion in such situations. Right now, despite what President Trump says he believes, Zelensky is polling well ahead of his rivals. That could all change in an election campaign, of course, especially one where the combined dark arts of influence of both Russia and the United States might be in play. So it will certainly have been suggested that maybe here is the best opportunity for these politicians to get their chance of the top job. The Republican foreign policy expert told Politico, Poroshenko's people and Yulia, they're all talking to Trump world, positioning themselves as people who would be easier to work with, and people who would consent to many of the things that Zelensky is not agreeing to. The very definition of what we know Vladimir Putin is looking for. The US has a lot of experience in understanding how to disturb internal political norms within other countries, so stirring the pot like this, encouraging the opposition to see early elections with US support as an opportunity for them, this in itself changes the conversation that previously was clear that it wasn't practical for that to happen. So Ruslan Bortnik, the director of the Ukrainian Institute for Politics, told Politico, "We are seeing some political factions starting to move. They're trying to establish informal connections or use the connections they have with the Republican Party or Trump's entourage and to indicate their willingness to work with Washington. They are also signalling publicly too, although their words are very soft, but they're displaying independent behaviour to show Trump they're ready to play his game. The elites are feeling very disoriented and shocked because they understand very clearly that without United States support, Ukraine will be defeated. The sense that things might move quickly is leading some of the political forces that have been constrained while the focus was purely on fighting to start becoming more active. So Tymoshenko has been approaching members of rival parties to encourage them to defect to her party. Reportedly, she has been telling them, in the process of trying to persuade them, that Zelensky will have no choice but to call elections soon, so now is the time to build a force likely to shape a new parliamentary majority. Against that, the fact that these discussions have now suddenly become public will not be welcome to those opposition leaders, because the last thing they want is for Ukrainians to get the sense that maybe they're collaborating with the US in selling the country out to Putin. So expect them to reject the call for early elections now, while they're still making sure that they'd be ready to move, should they be forced into reality anyway. The Trump administration is adding to the pressure with a recent move to stop sharing military intelligence with Ukraine. This is more disabling for Ukraine's ability to resist Russia than the previous ending of the shipment of new weapons, since some of Ukraine's most important and powerful existing American-supplied weapons depend upon American intelligence for targeting and guidance functionality, so they won't work without. Such intelligence has also been used to alert the Ukrainians to incoming attacks, enabling them to have a relatively high success rate in defending themselves against such attacks. The open question is whether this demonstration of Ukraine's vulnerability to a full-out hostile US administration will be ended soon, with Zelensky having now signalled to Trump his willingness to do what he must, or whether it will be maintained to allow Russia to drive home its advantage on the battlefield in the short term. Well, it turns out this latest move has electrified America's former allies, because it's really driven home to them how exposed they are in their own defence. Many allies of the United States have helped the US economy in the past by buying predominantly American weapons for their military. But significant numbers of those weapons also rely on US intelligence support for things like targeting, so the sight of America cutting that service when it wants, thereby rendering those weapons next to useless, that has made Europeans realise that they must never buy American weapons again in the future. Big problem, for instance, for the United Kingdom. Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, after all, isn't wholly standalone independent, because it had made the mistake over decades of assuming that America was a reliable ally. It allowed many of its systems to become extremely integrated with US ones. So on nuclear weapons, it buys Trident II missiles from the US. It has total operational control of those missiles once they're loaded onto its submarines. But the US and the UK decided to save money by having the missiles jointly maintained and the non-deployed missiles being kept at a stockpile in Georgia. Britain and America are working jointly on a new nuclear warhead, the W93, intended for deployment on US and UK submarines in more than a decade from now. Nicholas Drummond, a defence industry analyst, told the Times of London that it was, quote, extremely unlikely that Trump would cut off UK access to Trident missiles because, he said, it would be a strategic betrayal on a grand scale that would damage him, i.e. Trump, and America. And what optimistic take is that based on exactly? Well, everybody is rethinking such assumptions now. Drummond himself went on to say this: can you imagine a situation where Britain's relationship with America is fractured and they refuse to give us Trident missiles through the agreement that is in place? It would render the billions we have invested in dreadnought boats useless, a terrifying thought. And most tellingly, he then added this: anyone who suggested this a year ago would have been dismissed as an idiot. Now it is a scenario that we need to plan for. Add to that the 50 Apache helicopters that rely on American spares and upgrades, 2 aircraft carriers that often rely on US F-35 planes and other allies to make up a full carrier strike group, and so on and so on. It's quite a long list. It's rare that I do a video these days where the phrase unintended consequences doesn't feature somewhere, and so it is right here, because European countries are now urgently delivering massive boosts to their defence spending, and this is largely now going to be to the benefit of European defence manufacturers alone. The switch of European economies to this major extent of economic stimulus, just as America is grinding its own economy with tariffs aimed at its biggest trading partners, this means that European stock indices have caught up or outstripped Wall Street over the recent period. European defence stocks have soared. Germany's Rheinmetall is up 130% over 6 months. Infrastructure as well, Siemens Energy up 115%. Alain Bokobsa from Societe Generale said, "We have gone from all roads lead to the US to seeing numerous cracks to US exceptionalism. At the same time, we have seen several game changers in Europe, so Europe is back on the agenda." According to the Financial Times, some fund managers now say that Trump's Make America Great Again agenda has instead unleashed a Make Europe Great Again trade that is reordering global financial markets. And the thing is, the US could turn back on the flow of US intelligence to Ukraine right now. While I'm talking to you, I could turn off the camera, look at the news and see that they just did that. And it won't make any difference. From their point of view, their short-term objectives will have been achieved. Ukrainian political world unsettled, more volatile, more receptive to their actions on Vladimir Putin's behalf. But for the long term, no American allies will buy American weapons ever again. Because even those that continue to function regardless of what Washington does, they still rely on spares and maintenance from America. And that won't change depending on who wins the next US presidential election, because defence decisions are very long term. The damage America has done to itself is that by turning on its allies, becoming an adversary for Ukraine, it has shown that it is now so polarised internally that has become more important to it than any institutional memory about the commitments it's undertaken to external allies and commercial partners. So, which side in the polarised internal conflict is in charge in any one particular time? It's no longer the issue. America remains unreliable in the context of making long-term decisions. So yes, in the short term, Trump can destroy Ukraine. And for now, it seems like that's what he is minded to do. Maybe he will change his mind on that. A poll released today shows that Americans sympathise with Ukraine over Russia by a margin of 56-3. Can he be swayed by such public sentiment? Not seeing a lot of evidence for that, but maybe. But even if he did, with this regard, it is still too late. He's an old guy. He may not be around long enough to see all the ways that this is going to backfire on the United States in the coming volatile period in world history. But if he does nothing else but play golf for the next 4 years, he has changed the world in ways that the US in future is not always going to enjoy.